Greetings, comrades, and welcome to, well, certainly one of the strangest topics I've ever covered on the channel. Today, I'm going to be going down the rabbit hole of communist theme parks and experiences, which I can promise you is incredibly strange and bizarre. First though, I find that most people don't seem too familiar with Soviet history, so if it's not something that you haven't really been exposed to, let me catch you up to speed. As Russia abolished serfdom in 1861, the empire would then begin to quickly industrialize around the late 19th century. With a new and growing working class, civil unrest grew against the monarchy of Tsar Nicholas II, and in 1905, a strike by unarmed workers was put down violently by imperial troops. This led to a snowball effect throughout the rest of the Russian Empire, leading to mass strikes in what is now known as the Revolution of 1905. Under pressure from working class assemblies known as Soviets, made up of soldiers, farmers, and industrial workers, Nicholas II established a Duma, which was a Russian parliament that would work towards reform. However, as Russia entered the First World War in 1914 to counter German aggression against Serbia, the already fragile Russian Empire was drained of food and other resources, only further turning the country against the Tsar. In February of 1917, violent protests erupted in the Russian capital Petrograd, where the last of the loyal military guard were overwhelmed, and 3 days later, Nicholas II stepped down from power as a provisional government was established. Among various factions vying for power were the Bolsheviks, a divisive anti-war party rooted in Marxist ideology and led by Vladimir Lenin. In November of the same year, under a call for armed revolution from the Bolsheviks, soldiers and party members would storm the Winter Palace of Petrograd and dissolve the provisional government, assuming control themselves. While they would pull Russian soldiers out of the war, they themselves would fight in a Russian civil war until 1923, finally establishing control as the Soviet Union, a dictatorship under Lenin, but based around the philosophy of communism. For communism to work, the Soviet philosophy believed that it would need to be adopted worldwide, free from the influence of other powerful actors. This became the beginning of the Cold War, as Soviet communism was inherently at odds with the capitalistic systems of Western Europe and the United States. However, Lenin would die in 1924, and through a power struggle, Joseph Stalin would head the Soviet Communist Party as General Secretary. With the outbreak of World War II and the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Soviet soldiers would eventually help turn the tide of war and push back into Germany. As they did so, the Soviet Union would establish itself over much of Eastern Europe, and at the conclusion of the war, many of these countries would be forced into communist regimes that would answer to the whims of Moscow. So the Soviet Union and its various countries under its control would exist behind what is called the Iron Curtain by the West, practicing brutal oppression until its eventual collapse and dissolution in 1991. Under Soviet rule, citizens were never safe from secret police and other cruel authorities. They would often live under poor standards, starving and fighting for whatever scraps they could find. Dissidents to authority, or perhaps even just unlucky people, would find themselves thrown into gulags, prison camps where they would work until they died. The Soviet Union was a brutal, oppressive regime. So, Comrade, how would you like to travel to the former satellite state of Lithuania, pay $50, and then get whipped with a belt by a former KGB agent as he shouts at you in Russian and gets you to sign a confession statement? That sounds like an absolute blast, so let's dive into the absolutely bizarre world of the Soviet theme park. Very much like my video where I covered Christian theme parks, all radically different from one another but unified under a single theme, this video will be quite similar. I'll be taking on an eclectic handful of different themed experiences, and there's no better place to start than with the absolutely wild Soviet bunker. As I previously stated, this experience is located in Lithuania and is intended to teach younger generations and foreign visitors about the horror of Soviet rule. For younger children or field trips, the bunker exists more as an educational museum, but is still rather straightforward in how it teaches about Soviet oppression. However, as a themed educational experience for adults, it's actually kind of insane. The experience first starts when you arrive at a military checkpoint, playing the role of a Soviet citizen in 1984, and being provided clothes that reflect that late Soviet era. Participants will be lined up outside where an actor, played by an actual ex-KGB agent, will intimidate them by barking out instructions in Russian. This is intended to be authentically uncompromising, knowing that many younger Lithuanian or foreign visitors won't speak Russian and will have to suffer from not following the instructions. The prisoners will be marched to the bunker, an actual leftover and unused Cold War remnant. The bunker itself is large and maze-like, and as participants advance throughout different rooms, they will be instructed on how to live inside the bunker. This seems to include learning how to survive chemical warfare, visiting a commissary, some sort of propagandistic war room, and this absolutely terrifying dental chair, among others. The experience itself is unscripted, hosted entirely by ex-KGB agents who really get into the roleplay. If you choose to misbehave, well...
Nepasiduodantis arba specialiai provokuojantis, tai turim tamsių kambarėlių, išsivedi žmogų kažkur už kampo vieną, ir žmonės palūžta dažnai. Jeigu nepalūžta, tai apsisuka ir išeina.
If you think that's bad, just wait until they make you sign a confession statement in a language you probably don't speak. As part of the experience, you might be lucky and they'll whip you with a belt. Just so we're clear, people seem to be under the misconception that this is some sort of vacation experience.
It's totally different. Normally you lie down on the beach, you go to a party, and this is totally different. It's fun to do, but you need someone to translate it for you. Otherwise you don't understand anything out of it.
I cannot believe that he just described this as fun, but I'll take his word for it. I have to admit that there is definitely an educational appeal to it though.
Being force-fed communist propaganda was part of the charm of living in the Soviet Union, where the leaders knew best and the rest of the world was out to spoil the revolution. While we aren't subjected to physical harm, there is no room here for independent thought. The show attempts to break our will, just as it was in the USSR.
All joking aside, the experience in itself has received a lot of criticism for going a bit too far. However, the organization that runs the experience seems very committed to educating younger generations that never experienced the oppression of Soviet rule, hoping to instill in them a fear of such totalitarian systems. The previous segment also makes a good point, speaking about how people will look back fondly on Soviet rule with charm and nostalgia, often ignoring its oppressive nature. Vladimir Putin today certainly isn't shy about wanting to restore Russia to its Soviet glory, trying to establish a hegemonic regime over former satellite states. He famously even proclaimed that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. His consolidation of power over the last 2 decades, in addition to the current war in Ukraine, really highlights why educating people on the oppressive Soviet regimes is more important than ever. While Soviet's bunker is almost comically serious, on the flip side you can visit Grutas Park, also located in Lithuania. Often known as Stalin's World, this museum-like exhibit generates its own brand of controversy through its often irreverent tone. Founded in 2001 by Viliumas Malinauskas, a wealthy mushroom farmer, the park's main draw is the salvaged Soviet statues on display. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many of its symbols and relics were destroyed, yet many here were saved and put on display for the enjoyment of visitors. However, where Grutas Park certainly offers an educational aspect as a museum, the way it does so is what draws controversy. Areas of the park are designed to look like a gulag, throwing up elements such as barbed wire, mock guard towers, and train cars that transported people to die as Soviet military marches play over the speakers. Throughout, you will of course find various Soviet statues of leaders such as Lenin and Stalin, once symbols of brutal oppression, but are now available for visitors to take pictures with. It's the relaxed, casual atmosphere that seems to rub people the wrong way, with critics feeling that it is disrespectful to the many Lithuanian people deported or killed under Soviet rule. However, Malinauskas seems to not take the criticism seriously. He has stated that the point of the attraction is to joke at the expense of the Soviets, as Lithuania is no longer living under fear. At one point, he even proposed an idea to transport visitors to the park in train cars, as if they were being sent to the Gulag. Among the various Soviet artifacts, you can also find a playground which is great for school children, in addition to these small, poorly designed animal exhibits. It's kind of like a petting zoo, although I would be selective about which animals you choose to pet. At one point, a group of lawmakers attempted to shut the park down, but after having failed to do so, Malinowskis erected wooden statues of them right next to the Soviet ones. He was quoted as saying, "Those who are still afraid of shadows of the past deserve to stand here." He is certainly bold, but I also understand his perspective. While many of course see the park as disrespectful to the victims of the Soviet regime, Malinowskis seems to view it as not just a vessel for education, but for mockery. The ridiculous nature of the place and the disrespect shown towards the Soviet Union is his way of erasing their cultural power. Both Grutas Park and the Soviet Bunker exist as interesting themed experiences, yet still aim to educate. The way that they choose to vilify Soviets' rule is radically different from one another, but of course that's what makes them interesting. However, I would like to move forward and take a look at some of the strange parks actually built by the Soviets themselves. In 1935, an ambitious exhibit known as the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition would be established in Moscow, and after a series of delays, would finally open in 1939. Designed to be a Soviet's version of a World's Fair, the park would feature a number of temporary pavilions made from wood, designed to represent various facets of Soviet agriculture and showcase the triumph of collective farm construction. Many of the pavilions would represent various republics that had joined with Russia under the Soviet Union pre-World War II, such as Ukraine, Turkmenistan, Belarus, and various others. The complex also included pavilions dedicated to the working people of the Soviet Union, with some of these expressed through ideas such as mechanization and vegetable farming. Some of the more interesting pavilions represented ideas such as Arctic exploration, apiculture, or beekeeping if you're not familiar, the press, the refrigeration industry, and even peat, which makes sense with how concerned the Soviets were with agriculture. There was even a whole pavilion dedicated just to farming beetroot. Certainly weird by Western standards, but beets have been a staple of Eastern European diets, so its representation makes sense. However, since the buildings were temporary structures and the outbreak of World War II shuttered the park anyways, it wasn't until 1954 that it saw a major revival and began to resemble what we can still see today. This version of the park was also anchored by two fountains. The People's Friendship Fountain was adorned by 16 gilded women, dressed in clothing meant to represent the 16 Soviet republics of the time. Further on, visitors would witness the Stone Flower Fountain, covered in local stones and representing a Ural fairy tale, also known as the Stone Flower. However, after the death of Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev becoming General Secretary in 1956, the exhibition would see a pretty significant revival in 1958. Many of the old buildings were demolished and rebuilt to be more permanent and grand, wanting to impress the Eisenhower administration. Over the years, the exhibition would change names various times, evolving to include more science and industry. However, in 2014, the name would be changed to its current iteration, the Exhibition of Achievements of National Economy. Today, the park exists as a permanent world fair focused on Eastern Europe, still hosting pavilions based around former Soviet states and hosting a number of museums, not unlike a Soviet version of the US National Mall. One of the more interesting locations is the Cosmonautics and Aviation Center, focused on the history of Soviet aviation and space exploration. Another notable exhibit would be Russia, My History, which seems pretty self-explanatory from the name. One of the exhibition's newer attractions is the Muscovarium, which is the largest aquarium located in Europe. It's quite ambitious, and whether or not you agree with keeping dolphins and orcas in captivity, you cannot deny the impressive scale of the building. Finally, one last notable exhibit I would like to highlight is the scale model of Moscow itself, If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know I'm a sucker for scale models. Every hour, a light show will play, highlighting different elements of the city. Walking around, the exhibition, while of course quite contemporary, is also itself a museum of Soviet architecture. The aesthetic of the different buildings and monuments, in conjunction with the gardens, fountains, and statues, really does impress. Like many other Soviet expressions of art, it's made to make you feel as if you're an important cog in a larger machine, an essential component in a grand new society based around collective organization, expressed through public places almost utopian in nature. Despite the long-lasting legacy of Soviet oppression and the atrocities committed behind the Iron Curtain, it's also easy to see how people could look back on this society with nostalgia. Even younger generations who never experienced Soviet rule could look at something like this and be forgiven for yearning for an older time, feeling as if they were part of something larger than themselves. It's no mistake that as Putin continues to build his own spiritual successor to the Soviet Union, that this park has seen a recent revival over the last decade. Still, taken out of the context of authoritarian culture, its scale and architecture is quite fascinating. On the topic of Soviet nostalgia, I think it's worth mentioning Patriot Park, described as the Disneyland of Russia's military, whatever that's supposed to mean. Now, having opened in 2016, it is clearly meant to showcase the current capability and equipment of the Russian military, but among a nationalistic Russian public and a revival of Soviet nostalgia, I think you can connect the dots. Then again, I've seen plenty of stuff like this in the United States, so it's not entirely unique, although I think the designation of Russia's military Disneyland is quite funny. Traveling back to the actual Soviet era though, let's take a quick look at a few parks built under their regime. I could say that for the most part, there didn't really seem to be much in the way of theming. For example, 1928 would see the premiere of Gorky Park in Moscow, named after the socialist writer Maxim Gorky and sporting a few amusement rides. It would certainly evolve over the years, adding new attractions until 2011, when it was completely overhauled, removing all of the rides and rebuilding as purely a leisure space. Still, for decades, it worked as one of the more iconic amusement parks of the Soviet Union. Compared to Western Europe and the United States, Soviet rides also seemed like bad emulations, as you can see with Pripyat's long-abandoned Luna Park, which never officially opened because of the disaster at Chernobyl. This park seems to receive a little recognition in the West, mostly because its abandoned Ferris wheel became an intriguing, ghostly symbol of the Chernobyl disaster. However, like many other Soviet-era parks, the rides appear old and dated through their use of thin, spindly metal bars, definitely remnants of an older era. Another example of rides like this would be in a now demolished Lithuanian park, which used to be known in English as Children's World. It's notable for having contained a classic Schwarzkopf coaster model known as the Jetstar 2, but otherwise was just a series of flat rides. One of them is notable for having children ride in rockets, a common theme in the Soviet Union because of its space program. The world of Soviet theme parks doesn't seem to be documented very well, but they certainly are fascinating. What they used to be, and what remains today, serves as a stark reminder of the brutal Soviet regime, which continues to have a lasting effect on the lives of so many people today. Whether they look back on it fondly with nostalgia, or feel the need to express its brutality as bluntly as possible, the Soviet era is undeniably interesting, and is reflected through various amusements in Eastern Europe. If you found this topic to be uniquely interesting, and would like to see more stuff like it, you can show your support by simply leaving a like on the video. As always though, if you haven't already subscribed and hit the bell icon, you can do so to stay notified and be alerted to new videos as they release.